Czechast, a podcast in English about Czech and Moravian society, history, culture and economy.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of Czechast, the podcast in English about all things Czech. I'm Vít Pohanka, and in the past few days, not just Czechs, but the whole of Europe has been remembering the end of the First World War. And if you listen to Radio Prague International, you might have heard that to mark this anniversary, a special historic train ran from Prague to České Budějovice, then on to the Austrian border and back again, commemorating the return of the Czechoslovak Legionnaires to their homeland more than a century ago. Their courage and sacrifice helped make possible the birth of the newly founded Czechoslovakia. And it reminded me of a story that I produced a few years ago for Radio Prague International about those same men, their bravery and their extraordinary journey through Siberia back home. As you will hear, I have a personal attachment to the story because one of them was one of my ancestors and he actually died fighting against the Soviet Bolsheviks near the Ural Mountains. I frankly think that the story of the Czechoslovak Legionnaires in Siberia is a tremendous and historic epic. One that perhaps other nations would be more aggressively promoting. And I think we should be reminded of that. So, as I'm recording these words on the 11th of November, I thought it would be a good idea to do just that here in Czechast. Here is that report for Radio Prague International from a few years back.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.
The carillon on the old town hall in the town of Žďár plays a different tune every hour. Nearby, like in most Czech and Moravian or even Slovak cities, you can find a little plaque commemorating fallen legionnaires. Czechs and Slovaks who died, mostly in Russia, fighting for Czechoslovak independence against Austrian-Hungarian army or the Germans. For me, this particular plaque is a little personal, because one of the 11 names of the natives of Žďár who died in faraway lands is Vít Pohanka, and he was my great-granduncle. For many years, we knew only that he was killed in action somewhere near the Ural Mountains in November 1918. In order to reconstruct the story of my ancestor Eduard, I went to Prague to see Tomáš Jakl of the Military History Institute of the Czech Ministry of Defense.
V Rusku působilo před první světovou válkou v důsledku tedy cesty za prací až 100 000.
Even before the First World War, there were up to 100,000 Czechs and Slovaks in Russia. They came looking for work and business opportunities. Then there was a large Czech farming community, the so-called Volhynian Czechs. They had been invited by the Russian Empire in the 19th century to settle in the fertile lands in what is now western Ukraine. The Czechs in the big cities were mostly businessmen, tradesmen, or skilled professionals. There were Czech teachers of music and even arts. What's interesting is even Tsar Nicholas II admired the Czech sports and gymnastics movement known as Sokol. He decided to introduce their training methods within his own educational reform, so there were quite a few Czech teachers of physical education at Russian schools.
So when the war broke out, these Czechs found themselves in a country that was at war with Austrian-Hungarian Empire, of which their homeland was a part. Thousands of the Czech expats didn't hesitate to take up arms and joined the fight against the Habsburg monarchy, which they saw as an illegitimate oppressor.
V létě 1914 z toho prostředí českých a slovenských krajanů, zejména tedy českých krajanů, vznikla iniciativa na vytvoření dobrovolnických.
Already in the summer of 1914, a volunteer unit was forming from members of the Czech and Slovak community in Russia. The idea was that they would fight side by side with the Russians against Austria and Germany in order to liberate the Czech nation. In August 1914, a Czech battalion was formed and officially named Česká družina, Czech Companions. It was sent to the front in the autumn of that year and was deployed in Galicia.
Původně byla určena ruskou armádou k vlastně propagační a tlumočnické službě po předpokládaném průlomu do českých zemí. Nicméně k tomu...
The original idea was that the Czechs would help with war propaganda and as translators, since the Russian command expected to advance quickly into what is now the Czech Republic. That did not happen, and the front more or less stalled, with the armies deadlocked in trench warfare. So the Russians decided to use the Czech volunteers as intelligence agents, basically as scouts. So the Czech units were dispersed with various Russian divisions against the Austrian-Hungarian army.
By joining the Russian army, the Czechs and Slovaks risked literally everything.
Rakousko-uherská armáda se samozřejmě na ty zajaté starodružiníky dívala jakožto na zrádce a popravovala je bez...
The Austrian-Hungarian army naturally considered the Czechs and Slovaks fighting with the Russians as traitors. If captured, the Czechs and Slovaks faced the death penalty. No consideration was given to the fact that some of them were officially Russian subjects. In December 1914, the Austrians captured 2 such Czechs who were part of a large group that secretly crossed the front and were trying to get to Bohemia. A few of them did manage to get there, but Antonín Gurmela and Joseph Miller were publicly hanged on the main square in the town of Wadowice in today's Poland. They were the first Czechs fighting against Austria to be thus punished.
Vlastně sáhla k tomu trestu smrti příslušníkům nebo na příslušnících československých legií.
As the war dragged on, thousands of Czech soldiers who were forced into the Austrian army were being captured by the Russians and became prisoners of war. Many others, sometimes whole units, simply deserted and crossed the front rather than to continue fighting and dying for Austria. Soon they started joining the Russian army. And that was also how my great-granduncle Eduard found himself on the Russian side. We do not know exactly when and where he crossed the lines. What we do know was that he was a trained and skilled machinist, and he was certainly welcome, because the Czech prisoners of war were well known for helping to run Russian railroads and factories. However, the Tsarist regime, exhausted by the war, was toppled over by a revolution in February of 1918. And that meant complications for the Czechs in Russian uniform.
Klíčový představitel prozatímní vlády, počátku ministr obrany Kerenský, považoval tu
A key member of the provisional government was Alexander Fyodorovich Kerensky, first as Minister of War and later as Minister Chairman. He considered the Czech legions as a kind of relic from the Tsarist days and did not trust them. However, he changed his mind radically after the Battle of Zborov in July 1917.
Kdy vlastně ruská prozatímní vláda organizovala ruskou letní ofenzívu na východní frontě.
The Russian provisional government organized a summer offensive along the whole eastern front. It was a complete fiasco. The army was undermined by very aggressive and effective communist propaganda, would not fight, and the Russian units were in full retreat. In stark contrast, the Czech soldiers were able to capture 3 lines of enemy positions near Zborov. The Russian commanders praised them, and that led Kerensky to change his mind. In late summer and early autumn, there was a massive recruitment campaign among the Czech and Slovak prisoners of war. The first division of the Czechoslovak Corps in Russia was formed with 2 divisions, artillery and other units.
Sbor se 2 divizemi s dělostřelectvem a dalšími jednotkami.
Meanwhile, the 2 leaders of the international Czechoslovak efforts to gain independence arrived in Russia. Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, the future president, and Slovak general Rastislav Štefánik negotiated the transfer of the Czechoslovak legions to the Western Front. But things were to become even more complicated. The Russian communists, or Bolsheviks as they were then known, toppled the provisional government of Kerensky.
Československý sbor na Ukrajině zastihla ta říjnová revoluce, Leninův převrat, který svrhl prozatímní vládu.
The Czechoslovak Corps was still in Ukraine when the Bolshevik Revolution took place in October 1917. It was, in fact, a coup d'état organized by Lenin. Masaryk's instructions were clear. The Czechs and Slovaks were to be absolutely neutral and should not take sides in the internal Russian conflict that followed the revolution and was quickly becoming a full-fledged and ruthless civil war. So, at the beginning of 1918, the Moscow representatives of the Czechoslovak National Council reached an agreement with Josef Stalin, who was then the People's Commissar for Nationalities. The Czechoslovak Corps was to remain neutral, hand over its arms, and leave Russia for Europe via the Trans-Siberian Railroad and Vladivostok. The idea was that they would continue fighting against Germany and Austria on the Western Front in France.
Na západní frontu do Francie.
And at this point I get the first real news about my great-granduncle Eduard. He became a shooter with the 6th Battalion of the Czechoslovak Corps. It became clear very soon that the agreements with the Bolsheviks wouldn't last.
Na konci května Trocký rozesílá ten svůj pověstný telegram o tom, kde nařizuje zastřelit každého Čechoslováka, který bude přistižen na magistrále se zbraní v ruce.
At the end of May, Trotsky sent out an order that every Czechoslovak caught on the railroad with a gun was to be shot immediately. The local Soviet authorities started attacking trains with Czechoslovak soldiers, who in turn started to defend themselves and the railroad that was the only possible way to get to the west. Pretty soon the Czechs had got under control all the major cities along the railroad. Lenin and his commissars were taken by complete surprise. The Czechs were quickly joined by units of Cossacks and other Russian units still fighting Lenin's government, filling the vacuum left by fleeing Bolsheviks.
Po Čechoslováky svržených orgánech sovětské moci.
So Eduard found himself fighting for the control of the Trans-Siberian Railroad near the Ural Mountains in autumn of 1918. And according to written documents that I got from the Military History Institute, it was on the 8th of November that he was killed in action near a small village of Kordon. It isn't much, but at least we know where he's buried and that he died fighting the Bolsheviks. And what is perhaps most important, he didn't give his life in vain. His brothers-in-arms in the Czechoslovak Legions managed to control the Trans-Siberian Railroad and within 2 years evacuated about 70,000 Czechs and Slovaks via Vladivostok to Europe.
Oni velmi dobře věděli, jakým způsobem to tam chodí. Oni to Rusko znali velice podrobně, protože mnozí ještě jako zajatci byli.
They knew Russia very well and had many contacts among local Russian businesses connected with the railroad. Many of them had worked in different cities in previous years as prisoners of war. There had been a shortage of manpower. All the able men had to go to war, and well-trained, qualified and skilled prisoners of war were a godsend.
Klíčové skutečně bylo, že na stranu Čechoslováků se přidali tedy ruští železničáři, se přidali.
The key factor was that the Czechs and Slovaks were joined by local railway employees who saw them as liberators from the dictatorship of the proletariat. So they were not alone. They were greatly helped by the local Russian political and military forces that were trying to stop and reverse the Bolshevik tyranny.
Se od té komunistické krutovlády.
Vít Pohanka was actually one of the more than 4,000 Czechoslovak Legionnaires whose fighting spirit and eventual death in the vast spaces of eastern Russia laid the foundation of the democratic Czechoslovak Republic and its reputation.
Vlastně získali celosvětovou proslulost, kterou si dnes v podstatě ani neuvědomujeme.
They really won world recognition. It is no exaggeration. You must remember that in the spring of 1918, the Western powers were getting only bad news. Lenin had signed a separate peace with Germany and Austria. That gave the Germans advantage on the Western Front, and they started an offensive that seemed for a while unstoppable. And all of a sudden there was news that some small army of Czechoslovakia, a country no one had heard of until then, was in control of Siberia, an area 3 times the size of Europe.
Souběžně tedy ta německá ofenzíva je zastavena a spojenci přecházejí v létě 1918 do ofenzívy, která končí.
It coincided with a reversal on the Western Front, where the Allies finally took over the initiative, and it was becoming clear that Germany had exhausted its last strength during the spring offensive. This Czechoslovak contribution to the common victory of the Western democracies over Germany is often forgotten, even though it was and is very significant.
Zcela zapomenut a přestože byl tedy a je velmi veliký.
Says Tomáš Jakl of the Military History Institute. The Czechoslovak Legions then continued their evacuation from Russia until the spring of 1920. Some sailed from Vladivostok to the American west coast, crossed the US by rail to the east coast, and then sailed again across the Atlantic to Europe. Most went the other way, around South Asia and through the Suez Canal to the Mediterranean, finally disembarking in the Italian port of Trieste. From there, they traveled by train to their new homeland, Czechoslovakia. And the final part of their journey was recreated by that special train that I mentioned at the beginning. You've been listening to a special episode of Czechast, the podcast in English about all things Czech. Thank you very much for being with us. If you enjoyed this story, please like, follow or subscribe to Czechast. And if you haven't yet, check out our sister podcast, Prague of the Beaten Track, where I explore some of the city's lesser-known but fascinating places. Your support really helps us bring more of these stories to listeners around the world. As always, I'm Vít Pohanka. Thanks for listening. Stay healthy, stay safe and stay curious. And as we say in Czech, naslyšenou.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.